confess that I lived in Wellsville, New York, up until the end of 8th grade, so I know exactly where you guys are. Good people, great place to live.
This is The Cross Section with Nate Lull and David Edelstein. Featuring special guest, NFHS Executive Director, Karissa Niehoff.
Would you be able to just start by giving an introduction for yourself and just kind of explaining what your position is and kind of what you do on a daily basis?
Sure. I appreciate that question because a lot of people don't know exactly what we are and what we do. So I'm Karissa Niehoff. I'm the Executive Director of the National Federation of State High School Associations. The acronym NFHS is probably more familiar to people. So essentially in every state, you have an organization that implements state championships for high schools. And about half of those organizations also oversee speech, debate, music, theater, and academic competitions like Quiz Bowl. So in the country, there are 50 states and then Washington, D.C. So our membership is 51 state associations. They all belong to the National Federation. We are in Indianapolis. We are attached to the NCAA building, so I'm over there quite often dealing with our colleagues and great relationship with the collegiate community. But we basically write playing rules for 17 sports, guidance in a number of other sports. We provide guidance in sports medicine areas and risk minimization that have concern around co-curricular activities. We have an online learning platform that has nearly 80 courses that can be taken by students, coaches, parents, officials, John Q. Public. And we do a number of communication pushes for national leadership in what we call the second half of the school day, which is your co-curricular activities like sports and the other performing arts activities I mentioned. So we work closely with the USOPC, with national governing bodies, professional sport organizations, certainly the state associations and athletic directors. So it's we are the national high school voice for sport in particular.
And so I guess my first thought for you is that obviously here we're focusing a lot on the New York State Public High School Athletic Association, but you're focusing on all of these that you're trying to give guidance to and where everyone is. And we know very well at this point that different states are in different places during this pandemic, and they have different ideas of how their state associations can help bring sports back or what's possible due to population and all of that. Even within New York, every area seems to be different in our regions. So what are some of the challenges that you have to work with on a daily basis to try and understand where all these 50 or 51 states, I believe you mentioned, are, so that you can accurately provide guidance for all of them at once?
Yeah, great question. So I may be hard to believe, but the 51 executive directors and commissioners like Robert Zayas in New York, who, by the way, is a rock star, each of those 51, we're actually very closely connected. So we have at least once weekly roundtable conversations. We are maintaining in Indianapolis at our office a visual, an infographic of all the 51 associations, where they are with delaying, with postponing. We have a working spreadsheet. So we feel like we have our finger on the pulse, and we have really great guys like you in our office that are just scouring the media, Meltwater in particular, every day, just looking at, what states are choosing to do. I will say that it looks different because state associations have to pay attention to governor's decisions. As you all know, Governor Cuomo was out there right away with daily briefings, and also the departments of education and state health agencies. So all of those authorities help state association offices make their decisions. And then within that, you've got the local school districts. The world of public education has really been proud of, having boards of education, superintendents of schools that make the decisions for their local area. So it's all of these stakeholders that are helping to define what it's going to look like. And of course, in New York, you have your 11 sections, all that function like associations in and of themselves. So New York is complicated. You all are very big and complicated. And then you have the public schools in the city. So it looks a little different by design, and it looks a little different by decision. And that's probably the most appropriate way to do it. All of that being said, our national position is that not only do we want to pay attention to COVID-related concerns, the local numbers, the strategies in place, the resources, but we also want to pay attention to some emerging research about kids, how they feel, how they're doing when they're not engaged in school, they're not engaged in activity. And there's a research study out of Wisconsin that has over 3,000 student athletes reporting that they feel a higher rate of depression, anxiety, increasing thoughts of suicide, disconnect, apathy. So we really want to know how our kids are doing and feeling, and consider that as well as we make decisions and allocate resources to get kids back. So we're advocating for folks to be as informed as they can be at their level, to absolutely put strategies in place and, if possible, get kids reconnected. It may mean that some activities happen sooner than others. That's just a reality. But we're trying to carve the education environment out as not being the same as recreational sports or youth sports or club sports or collegiate sport for that matter. High school age education-based activities are different. So kind of the position we're taking now, trying to provide as much guidance as we can.
In your position, obviously, to see things across the entire country, I was curious your take on, New York's plans, tentative plans that they've put out so far, and how that might compare to the rest of the country. Is New York being more cautious, less cautious? Like, what's your opinion on that?
Yes, well, compared to some places that are actually having state championships like Iowa right now, baseball and softball, New York is not doing it at that pace. I think what New York has done is made a statewide decision that's most appropriate for New York. And then, of course, within the sections, you're going to see different densities and population. You're going to see different levels of contagion in COVID. We're starting to see some states that are delaying, but then will be phasing in. That, in fact, is emerging as the majority right now as decisions are made. They're just starting a little slower and offering local districts to make some of those decisions without penalty, if you will. So there are some creative ideas about the road to a state championship. Is it an abbreviated season, reduced number of contests? So it absolutely will look different. And we really applaud our state associations for doing what's best for their own state, and recognizing and supporting the nimbleness that has to happen within local districts as we pay attention to the numbers. So New York's, they've made a decision, which actually is out in front of about half of our state associations right now. So they were paying attention early, really considering a lot of dynamics, and arrived at a decision which may change depending on numbers. But New York's done a good job getting out in front.
I feel like one of the misconceptions some people had, or that was brought to light during all this, a lot of people in the communities just kind of expected that the New York State Public High School Athletic Association kind of was in charge of all the sections in the state, all of the 11 New York sections. And Rob Zayas and I have spoken a bunch of times, and he keeps telling me to make sure people understand that they're not in charge of the sections. They're giving the guidance, and they're working with them and trying to help them out so that they can make their own decisions.
Right.
I feel like that's kind of the same role you're explaining the NFHS plays for the state associations. You're not telling them what to do, but you're kind of giving them this overall guidance, so that they can each, interpret that as needed. But even in that context, what, from your perspective, you are offering this guidance, and some are following it in this way or interpreting it this way for their own states. But from your kind of overall perspective, what are some of the really great things you see different states doing to ensure safety and all that? And maybe what are some of the areas where you still think there can be improvement?
So great. You guys are spot on. You get it. The National Federation is a federation by design. The NCAA is an association. And the two kinds of ecosystems are a little different. A federation by design means the states can have their own regulations, bylaws to do what's best. Everybody's membership driven. So the state associations have boards that make their decisions by membership contribution. The National Federation, our member state associations guide our board of directors. So it's worked for 101 years. Our membership likes it. So as of now, we are still in that formation by design. Within New York, as Robert said, each of the sections can implement a little differently what they need to do. But all that being said, there's tremendous weight that is placed on the guidance that Robert's office can offer and that our office can offer states. They take what we offer very seriously. The guidance about returning to activity that we provided offered 3 tiers of perceived risk based on potential contact and aerosol spread. We also gave a guidance in terms of phases back to activity. We sent that guidance to states in Word document format so they can take whatever pieces of that, use it as they see fit, with appropriate citation of research that we've included. But our states and within the states, the relationship that's there is very much a trusted one. They rely on us as kind of the mothership to be out in front and lead and provide positions and voices and resources, amicus briefs in court when necessary. But we also allow them to make their decisions, and we try to support them as best as possible.
You had mentioned that study earlier that they were looking at for student athletes and how they were feeling without sports and depression and things along those lines. But I've also heard you say that it's been hard for travel sports as well. We're seeing a lot of kids go to travel sports, and that can be risky for sure. But it's a way to get them back out there as well. Is there a way maybe we can meet in the middle? Do you think that depends on where you are, and again, following those guidelines that you put out and each state puts out? Is it all really depend on where you are geographically? I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do think it's feasible to kind of meet in the middle. A lot of youth sport programs got out there pretty quickly a couple of months ago with tournaments right away and things like that. And, that was concerning to me. I'm just speaking, personally at this point. I think a number of us that lead sport organizations watched that happen. Even the national governing bodies that often they sanction some of the youth programming that help to feed their pipeline. A lot of those programs were not sanctioned by national governing bodies. So we all kind of looked and thought, we've got to watch this carefully. I think, though, if there are ways to get kids back to activity with a lot of information first up front, a lot of education of all the stakeholders, a lot of preparation with strategies in place for sanitation, for social distancing as best as you can, for not using locker rooms, for example, right away, or sharing equipment or hydration stations. Get kids back together in small pods as they practice, and do some things that we've been talking about for a while now regarding COVID precautions, and watch that for 10 to 14 days. If there's no cases, no spread, or certainly a decrease in the community, go to the next phase. Right now, the hottest question that we're getting is, if they're not back in school, in-person learning, is it feasible to still come together in person for activity? Again, I think it depends on where you are, what the activity is. If you're conducting that activity outside and in fresh air, that's different from a classroom. We actually asked our state leaders the other day in a roundtable discussion, what are your states doing about that? And some of our states look at, even if it's virtual learning, a school day is a school day. So it counts. if they can do physical activity in person safely, they're exploring that. So I think that's where we're going to meet in the middle. And again, depending on where you are, Nate, and I think it's feasible. We can get it. You can get it done.
That was actually leading right into my next question, which was probably the biggest point that stuck out from when I listened to that press conference for Monday, is when you said that, you know, it is a possibility that if there's online learning, that there could be athletic activity, because the biggest thing here has been that question also, because Governor Cuomo is asking for guidance by tomorrow, actually, Friday, July 31st, from all of the different school districts to submit their proposals on how they'd reopen. And then next week, sometime first week in August, we're expecting a decision on schools and whether they're reopening. And it's been this domino effect that I've heard from all the coaches and Dr. Zayas and everyone. So it's that decision is going to come and influence what happens next. So it was very striking to hear you say it is a possibility. In what context is that a possibility? What do you think states should be considering when they do get their own decisions about whether schools open in person or partially in person or online? What should they be considering when they get that decision and then have to make the decision about athletics?
Yeah, so I appreciate that you had that preface there, that if they get the word, that they can go ahead and decide on their own. And some states actually have that privilege. Their governors have said, I'll talk about youth sports, but I'm going to let the state association make the decision about what they want to do with interscholastic high school. So that's happening. I think first and foremost, pay attention to what the COVID numbers are and the trends there. Obviously, the national news tells us nationwide what states are hot spots and how, you know, things are happening from a state perspective. So know that. Absolutely educate everybody. Parents, student athletes, schools. Work closely with your state Department of Education, your health agencies, your local districts to kind of gauge readiness. Who's ready to come back? Because a state association can make a decision, oh, we want to go back and modify our schedule toward championships. But if school districts aren't ready, it's not going to happen. So, and readiness to go back to activity is one thing, but to cross town lines, to compete, that's a whole nother conversation. So I think I would advise, know the COVID numbers, educate, gauge the level of readiness in your schools, and then by all means, phase in and watch numbers as you go along. But it's got to be a collaborative conversation. It's got to be an educated conversation, and we have to have preparation in place for how to best keep kids safe with regard to having activities, yet out of respect for COVID. So I would take those kind of general steps if and when that privilege to make that decision happens. And just know that it's going to look a little different across schools.
I do want to jump in with a follow-up to that too, which is here on our pretty local level that Nate and I typically focus on, we have a lot of central New York schools that are smaller. Their athletic programs also are therefore smaller, and there are a lot of combined school district teams where they might, for soccer play together or for football play together. And that's crossing the town lines also. I doubt it's going to be an NFHS, guidance or even decision making to focus on the very, small level of school districts. But whose decision is it? Who should be considering that component of, well, we can't cross state lines for competition maybe, but what about even having our team practice to begin with, because it naturally crosses the town lines probably.
Yeah. So co-op teams, that will likely be the decision by each of those school district leaders. Are we comfortable even sending our kids across town lines to practice? And I, knowing Central New York a little bit, a lot of those towns are similar that are in that area, similar small. So hopefully their COVID numbers are similar as well. And the decisions can be a little more aligned, easier by each of the districts that participate in these co-op programs. But it would be a local level decision to re-engage. The state association typically talks about the rules and regulations around numbers of contests, and what is required to enter a state tournament. And then the state association, of course, implements the state tournament itself. So what school districts choose to do in terms of regular season, as we've seen in Iowa, some school districts chose not to compete at all. They tended to be in the more metropolitan areas in Iowa, but the great majority of schools said, we're more rural, we're going to give it a shot. So it's going to be a little bit organic, but certainly starting at the local level about co-op programs.
With the return of some major league sports, is that something that you've looked at and some of the hoops that they've had to jump through and successes they've had or problems that they've had? Is that something that you guys can look at and can you translate that into your plans or anything at the high school level?
Yeah, so we're of course paying attention to what's going on in sport at all levels. Certainly the professional sports have resources that are unbelievable to create the bubbles, to test athletes on a frequent basis, and certainly, making decisions from there. We are watching, of course, what's happening, especially in Major League Baseball. We're going to be watching football very closely, but we're also paying attention to the smaller conferences at the NCAA level, where some of our small D1s and then 2 and 3 are saying conference-only games, and even sometimes decisions about geographic locale within the conferences. So we're watching those kind of models to see, well, maybe we're not playing in some multi-state tournaments at high schools. We're going to maybe look at that. Playing only within the conference, maybe not outside of the conference, even though sometimes we need those games on our schedule. So we're paying attention to some of the higher level decisions and seeing if we can't overlay some of that model onto high school challenges, but at the same time saying that our level is different. In talking with college commissioners, and I do this on a weekly basis because we do want to stay in touch. Many more college presidents and commissioners are saying, if kids are coming back to campus, and it looks like in many places they are, we want to use our student athletes as leaders and role models for the rest of the student body about how to behave socially. And they do have some degree of confidence that when student athletes are back on campus, they're probably in a more controlled environment regarding COVID and protection and even medical access than they might be if they were just in their home community. So we're starting to try to generate some comfort around what we can offer on campuses in the way of resources and adult supervision, at least while the kids are in our presence.
I know that obviously I can imagine no one saw this coming. No one saw, all these effects that we'd have happen on so many levels and how the world would change as it has. When you think of the processes that the NFHS has gone through as far as providing guidance and interpreting the situation at the times it did, is there anything that you wish that had been done differently? Or is there anything also on the other hand that you think was done very well in retrospect?
Well, my goodness, no one saw this coming. And certainly when we saw it coming, we didn't see it coming like a freight train. Nobody's asked me that question yet, and I appreciate that. I'm not sure if I can say there's anything off the top of my head we should have done differently. I think we all felt like we were kind of like, oh my gosh, we better get going on this, feeling like it was out ahead of us already. I don't know if we saw it coming as fast as it did, but we engaged our Sports Med Advisory Committee really early on, and they worked. Within 2 weeks' time, we had guidance out to our state associations. What I am pleased about is that our guidance appeared on the scene as more conservative as other guidance that was starting to emerge. So our phase-in process was more conservative than some that we saw coming out of single sport organizations at the youth level that tended to go back quicker. So I was actually very pleased that we were more conservative. We released our paper on cardiopulmonary concerns, and we're still watching this research on the impact of COVID-19 on the cardiac muscle and permanent damage to the pulmonary situation. So I think we tried to get out there as quick as we could. We were still behind COVID. We were behind COVID. It was already, I mean, in February 28th, I believe we had 14 cases in the US that were formally diagnosed. And by the week of March 11th, it was that week that pro sports suspended, NBA suspended, NCAA suspended. We left our office on Friday, March 13th, and we're still not back. So everybody was hit fast. But if we could have been faster out of the gate with guidance, that's probably what we would have hoped to do. But we had, by the end of March, we had some guidance for our folks, and we were happy about that.
It does seem that it was pretty fast too, and you almost think, they say hindsight's 2020. Ironically, it's 2020 now, but the year. But you look back and you think, okay. But I do think that we've, one thing that I've heard on the local level is the reporters around me and myself have asked local kind of health officials, and also I've heard from on the state association level that they're always consulting the state health department, because a lot of this guidance I've heard relies on the health guidance and our health professionals understanding, the health experts understanding of this virus. And thinking back to March, like the understanding of the virus has changed so much over time too, about how it transfers and what it can do and all of that. Has that impacted the guidance that the NFHS has provided? And maybe how frustrating is that to, think you have an understanding at one point in March, but by the time you get to April, May, June, July, the entire virus idea of what that is has changed. So the reaction to it and how you prevent it might have changed too.
Yeah. Well, early on, I think we were more concerned about contact on surfaces. And what we're realizing now is that surface contact, especially if it's outdoors and in sunlight, has become not as concerning as it was early on. What is terribly concerning is the length of time someone can be asymptomatic without any symptoms whatsoever and still be such a carrier and an exposer, and the rapid contagion with aerosol spread. So we're doing this aerosol study, you probably heard us mention it on Monday, and the early indications are that even verbal, normal tone speaking can spread, aerosol spread for feet. So the social distancing is absolutely important. And wearing a mask, those two things make a significant difference in spread of respiratory droplets is a heaviness, but certainly aerosol spread. So we're learning that is absolutely important to remember. And the concerns that are arising now seem to be from careless gatherings, where people have gotten together and the masks weren't there all the time, and it's quick. So I think what we've learned too is that the younger population is more of a concern than we originally thought. Even if they're not demonstrating the degree of illness that older people do, they still are spreaders, they're carriers, and we need to be just as concerned in our young people.
I guess my last question is, you had the unique job of seeing what people are doing all across the country and different states, and I was just have an impossible question, but are there certain I've been so impressed with what they're bringing to the table, maybe something that you would suggest to other states, like, hey, this model really seems to be working. I didn't know what you were finding in the department right now.
Yeah, so I think it depends on their geographic location. So, for example, Washington, D.C., hugely urban areas. And in speaking with their state association executive director, he said, Karissa, a lot of my kids live with elderly grandparents in the city of Washington, D.C. So when they made the decision to do a January to June model, we thought that was fantastic. So there's still positivity on the horizon, but they're being very considerate of the home environments of a lot of their kids. Looking at Iowa, their environment was such that they went ahead and they played their softball, baseball summer seasons, which they normally do. The list of things that they had in place for precautions was outstanding. So they were able to pull it off. In some states where they have a climate that is more year-round friendly to field sports, and don't we wish New York had that?
Yeah.
You got your New Mexico that you move football to the spring, where they'll be able to play a fall sport in a spring season. So we really applaud the personalization, to be very careful, yet still give the kids something to look forward to. And none of our states, as they're making these decisions, I'll tell you, we talk with our folks and we know there's a fiscal impact that is absolutely massive right now. But our states are talking about the well-being of kids and getting them back to activity. They're not talking about, that's not the first thing on their mind is, well, if we've got to do this because we need money. No, it's really been about the kids. And I'm so impressed by our states.
Yeah, the biggest message that I've heard when talking with any of the section leaders or executive director Robert Zayas or any of the coaches and the student athletes, parents, is that they just want to get back to some kind of participation on the field, getting the kids together, the student athletes, and having them socialize. And that's pretty cool when you realize that sports is more than just winning a state championship and going for the title. It really has all these other life impacts, which, I mean, even in this crazy situation, we get to witness firsthand of all those parts only because they're missing right now, which is unfortunate, but we are learning that it's that important. I guess my final kind of two questions, as we're kind of concluding, you've given us such an abundant amount of insight on how these decisions are made. And I think that everyone will appreciate seeing that, because there is that process where the, NFHS, the state, the sections, and then the localities are really working together to figure this out. When we look to the future now, we've got to think that the world and especially sports are probably changed forever in some ways. I'm wondering, from your perspective right now, what effects do you think this situation will have going forward on high school athletics? What are some things that might remain afterward, or what have we learned from this that will stick around?
That's a great question. I think until we have a vaccine, we are going to be in this kind of permanent state of ambiguity. This is an unknown that we've not dealt with before. I think once we have a vaccine, we'll be able to feel a little more confident in going out there with a little more comfort that there's some sort of mitigation there should there be contagion with COVID. I do think we are forever going to be looking at how we sanitize equipment, how we look at students, for example, the pre-participation physical. That's going to need to have a whole new element now regarding COVID-19 or any other COVID strain that will likely emerge. I think we have to be very cognizant of paying attention to where our kids are coming from and where they're going and what health situations exist. We're going to need to pay attention to what happens if someone does get sick, and being, really honest about their ability to continue or not continue participation. I don't think our national culture wants football to go away, or wrestling to go away, or for it to look different for that matter. I think that we need our full contact sports and we want them. We're just going to be probably at a more high level of alert as to what we do beforehand and during regarding viral spread. So we're going to need to have more resources allocated to our sport programs so that mitigation measures are there, sanitation processes are there. And we're going to need to be ready should something happen in the future so that does it change a schedule? Does it change a season? We have to relax a little bit about how rigid we've been for 101 years regarding the pathway to the championship, for example. So there'll be some operational things we'll have to be very attentive to, but I think from a health and safety perspective, we're at a new level of knowledge and awareness forever.
It's almost like a new level of education. I have to think that even from this crazy situation, not all of what we've learned is bad. We might be more educated on how we do things going forward in this kind of globalized world that we live in the 21st century. And I know that one thing you had mentioned in that press conference also was that this isn't just a single year issue, that it's, financial things, or whether it's these procedures that need to be put in place, that this will have that carryover impact. One thing I like to do at the end with these conversations is because it's, sometimes it's a press conference, you've got the media there, and then they tell everyone, here's your chance, the executive director of the NFHS, to speak to the student athletes and the parents and the families and directly. What is kind of the biggest message right now that you want them to know from you with everything that you're doing?
I think the first message is that the National Federation family empathizes with a number of things. Number one, for the kids, that you've not been able to play for a long time, and we know you miss it. We are collectively, as adults around you, working together to try to bring you back in a safe way. To parents and families, and certainly to decision makers in schools, we empathize with the anxiety and the responsibility that you have. We absolutely respect the range of readiness that exists when you're sitting at the dinner table and you listen to the news, and there's anxiety in the news, and we respect that, and no one is trying to rush blindly back. We encourage you and will support you in any way that we can with resources and information. We do have a COVID-19 course that's free on our website for coaches and administrators that talks about how we might get back to activity, and maybe for parents that'd be of interest as well. But we respect all of these dynamics and these very significant nuances around making decisions about going back. And we also know that we may have to start and stop. And we respect that too. That's a very realistic possibility. So I would say to parents and families, how are you all feeling? How are you feeling as a student participant? How are you feeling in terms of your own comfort level about going back? How much do you know about what going back will look like in your particular program? Whether it's your school program, your club program, what is it going to look like? What details do you know about precautionary measures that are in place? And, all of those things should weigh into your decision. What do you know about the COVID situation where you live? So we absolutely, as a national family, want to support states, schools, and the actual stakeholders themselves. What do you need to know? How can we help you? How can we help states? And please know that we are respectful of every single one of you out there, all 12 million kids that we deal with in 20,000 high schools, and the families.